we're seeing a wave of migration right now in the Americas that looks very different than the migrations we've seen in the past. We are seeing not only people headed to the United States, mostly Central Americans, not Mexicans right now, but lots of Central Americans, but we're also seeing large numbers of Venezuelans and Nicaraguans who have gone almost every country in the hemisphere. And that's a new development. This is something different than we've seen in the past. Countries that once were sending societies for migrants have now become recipient countries, and large numbers. Colombia has 1.4 million Venezuelans. Costa Rica has probably received about 100,000 Nicaraguans in a year and a half, about 2% of their population. There's probably close to 1 million Venezuelans in Peru, 300,000 in Ecuador, another 300,000 in Chile. These are large numbers, and it's touched almost every country in the region. And we're seeing two very different sets of policies. So in the United States, we have seen a gradual closing of the possibility of people coming to the United States who are fleeing for their lives, to be able to enter and ask for asylum. The asylum process is slowly closing down through a series of rules and agreements with neighboring countries, with Mexico and Central America, that make it very difficult to access the U.S. asylum system in a timely way, or perhaps at all. And that's both slowing economic migration, but it's also slowing people who are fleeing from violent situations, these mixed migration flows that include people that are more economic migrants and more refugee-seeking migrants. In Latin America, on the other hand, we've seen actually a much more open policy where most countries have been willing to take people in, at least in the short term, and actually have tried to regularize their status, have tried to actually give large numbers of the Venezuelan and Nicaraguan migrants some sort of legal status while they're in the country, access to education, at least to basic education and emergency health care, and in some cases try and actually give them a long-term status in the country. Now this may be reversing slightly. We may see a bit of a rebalancing going on in some countries like Ecuador and Peru and Chile are making it harder to come into those countries. But certainly the neighbors, certainly in terms of Colombia and Brazil and Guyana, an incredible openness still to people coming to those countries, entering the labor market and being part of the legal economy and part of society. And still in countries like Ecuador and Peru and Chile and Argentina and Costa Rica and Mexico, still a lot of openness to people staying in those countries as well. So a bit of closure in the north, where the U.S. is involving Mexico in trying to close down its border as well, but still largely a great deal of openness to people in mixed flows, fleeing violence, fleeing economic meltdown in Venezuela and Nicaragua to arrive in those countries. You know, it's interesting. Part of what happened in the past 15 years or so in Latin America and in the Caribbean as well was very much like what happened in the European Union. There was a real attempt to create free mobility within the region, tied to greater economic integration. And so there was a lot of lowering of getting rid of visa requirements, making it easy for people to come in, sometimes even with national ID cards instead of passports, among countries in the region. And there were a lot of bilateral agreements around this, and some of them were the context of Mercosur and UNASUR and the Andean Pact and CARICOM. And now we're seeing a bit of a pulling away from that. So we're seeing, some internal borders within Latin America and the Caribbean countries come up. So new visa requirements for people that move, although it's a case-by-case basis. Some countries are still very open. Like Argentina or Uruguay are still extremely open, but other countries are putting some barriers up. And we are seeing certainly some more skepticism in Trinidad vis-a-vis Venezuelans, so much less ability for Venezuelans to come in and have access to services. And the United States looks a lot like Europe vis-a-vis its external borders. So the United States treats Latin America and Latin American and Caribbean migrants much like Europe does migrants from elsewhere in the world, from outside the European Union, outside the Schengen area, where there is, an attempt to make asylum less accessible, work with neighboring governments to see if they can find ways of keeping people at home before they leave, find ways of returning people in an expedited way. With the Trump administration in the United States, that's probably moved faster. So there's been an attempt to really limit access to asylum much more than Europe has done, in a much more drastic way. But certainly the tendencies, the inertias, and the worries about the rest of the world coming, to our shores are similar in the United States as what they are in many EU countries. Yeah, in the United States, it's really hard to predict what's going to happen on immigration policy. I mean, it's become such a front and center issue, such a hot issue in politics, because it's part of our debate about a changing America, changing economically, changing demographically, but also because Donald Trump made it the center of his presidential campaign and the center of his presidency. And so it's become a red line issue both for Democrats and Republicans. And for the first time, historically, immigration was very much a bipartisan issue in the United States. You could find Democrats and Republicans who were, most Democrats and most Republicans were fairly pro-immigration, but they would have different areas of emphasis. And then you had people in both parties who, for different reasons, were very skeptical of immigration. It's become much more of a partisan issue where Democrats tend to be more favorable, Republicans more against, in part because Trump has made it such a central issue to his presidency. And I think that means that this will be a major issue in the campaign, in the 2020 presidential campaign. And it means that what happens politically in the next, year and a half in the United States will really determine what happens in policy terms on immigration. It will be a lot of pressure if a Democrat wins to have a different set of policies. And if Donald Trump wins, it's hard to see how he doesn't continue to embrace some of the same hardline policies he's had on immigration, although there's a faction of the Republican Party that still keeps pushing for looking at this as an issue of competitiveness and the fact that we need workers in the United States. But probably the more restrictionist side of Donald Trump will win out. And Democrats, it's hard to tell, but they probably will have pressure to do something different, something creative on asylum, something creative on immigration, though it's not clear from their platforms exactly what most of them would do and what political space they have.